Having tackled the last couple of exercises, we're now in a position to return to the rabbi's opening speech to see what Halevi's basic approach to God is. So, in section 25, the rabbi explains why he began as he did in section 11 and why it's philosophically effective. What the rabbi is saying is, look, we believe in God because we basically met him, so of course he exists. There's no need for any sophisticated philosophical argument here. We know God exists because he spoke to our forefathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, or Jacob. He took us out of Egypt with signs and miracles, and ultimately he revealed his Torah through Moses at Mount Sinai. So, as he says in section 25, he doesn't need to appeal to some argument that proves some kind of creator God. As with our bear in our previous discussions, he can just point to the God that he met. Now, of course, you might argue that God hasn't actually appeared to any of us at any point, and Halevi does have to therefore add to his argument and appeal to tradition, as he says here. He has to argue first from personal experience and afterwards through uninterrupted tradition, which is equal to the former. So Halevi has to add this appeal to tradition at the end of this section, and he has to argue that an enormous amount of people were at Sinai. That's very significant for Halevi. If it were only one or two people, it's possible they could be hallucinating, but not an enormous mass of people. And they pass down their experience through the generations. Now that for Halevi is a perfectly reliable basis for our belief. And if you think about it, it is true. We, A, usually take the evidence of our experience as being true, and B, we usually accept the reports of such experiences from others. We take that to be reliable. Think of all the times your friends have told you they saw something and how often, if not always, you believe them. Now, there are all sorts of problems with Halevi's argument, and we will deal with them in due course. But for the moment, I want you to recall the philosopher's speech to the king that we looked at in week 3, and the type of God to which his approach led, as opposed to the type of God to which we are led by Halevi's argument here. Halevi's argument leads us to a God who interacts with humanity, a God with desires, a God who knows and speaks to his people. We experienced that. The philosopher's God, on the other hand, was apparently a perfect God, yet he did none of these things. The philosopher's God was a philosophical ideal rather than a living God. He was, if you recall, above desire and intention and above the knowledge of individuals. So the fact is that Halevi's argument leads us to a very personal God who is involved. The philosopher's argument leads us to a God of philosophy, a God who isn't in any way involved, but is some kind of philosophical ideal. What's interesting is that Maimonides has rather more in common with the philosopher than with Halevi's rabbi. Now, Maimonides presents his arguments in the first chapter of the second part of the guide, and as you'll see, he prefaces it with 25 different propositions of Aristotelian philosophy. The argument we're going to look at appears quite complicated, but it's actually quite straightforward in essence. And it's an argument that's also used by the great Christian thinker St. Thomas Aquinas as one of his famous 5 ways. And that's been reproduced for you in the following form, set out very nice and clearly in premises, numbered premises and conclusions. You may need to spend some time with this and go over it a few times, but the basic idea is relatively straightforward. It begins from the fact that we are all aware of things that have come into existence at some point and will go out of existence at another point. Pretty much everything we encounter is like this. Everything we encounter goes into existence and comes out of existence. Now, in the medieval terminology we're going to be using, these things are said to be subject to generation and corruption. Or, alternately, they are called possible existence or possible beings. Now, the point of the argument is that not everything can be like this, because if it was, then at some point in time, nothing would have existed. Everything would have gone out of existence at some point. That's what's argued for here at C2. If for each thing at some time it does not exist, then at some time nothing exists. Now, this is actually a very controversial move in the argument, probably the most controversial move, and hopefully in the exercise that follows, you'll understand it a little better. Nonetheless, if we accept that, then the problem is that if at some point in time nothing existed, then since you can't get something from nothing, the world as we have it now would not exist. That's pretty much the argument from P4 through P6. So if at some point nothing existed, how could anything exist now? That's the challenge. And the point is at P7, but something does exist now. The world does. We're here. It exists. But that means there must have been something that didn't go out of existence. There must have been something that was always there, that can't go out of existence. What we call a necessary existent, or a necessary being. And that necessary being was the cause of things coming into existence, or it was always there to bring things back into existence. And that necessary being that exists in a way that's completely different from the way anything else exists is what we call God. Now, that's more or less the kernel of the argument that Maimonides gives, as you're about to discover in the following exercise. By the end of it, you'll hopefully be a little more comfortable with all of this terminology.